Hello and welcome to the Agenda podcast here on the Blood Red channel. I'm Guy Clarke, alongside me Liverpool.com editor Matt Addison, as we get set to talk through 9 of the best for the Reds, sweeping aside Bournemouth at Anfield with relative ease, and Roberto Firmino notching his 100th goal for the Reds in the process. Plus, we'll touch on a number of the youngsters, both Harvey, Elliott and Fabio Carvalho, scoring their first Premier League goals. But Matt, first things first, looking at the game, I mean, the scoreline suggests it, but it was Liverpool at their very best and free-flowing.
Yeah, free-flowing, I think, is a good way of putting it. I think Liverpool just looked a lot more fluid and a lot more fluent. I think definitely after the Manchester United game, but probably after the first couple of matches of the season as well, in the Fulham and the Palace matches, you kind of had a few questions, really, of exactly what Liverpool were trying to do in terms of their attacking. I think there was a number of people who made the point that Salah and Diaz looked really far apart and didn't really connect very well. There were questions about Roberto Firmino and kind of how the midfield fitted into all of this stuff. I just think yesterday, as much as Bournemouth are absolutely atrocious, they really didn't offer anything at all at Anfield. I think what we did see was kind of at least a kind of practice run almost of how Liverpool want to play. I think we saw Trent in the right positions. I think he looked a little bit nervous and a little bit wary of making a mistake until he managed to score the goal. And from that moment, it kind of clicked. I think there was a few players who were like that. And you've got to kind of hope, really, that it clicks for them collectively as well as individually. I think this has got to be, a real turning point for Liverpool. I mean, I looked actually that the last time they had a win kind of like this was that 7-0, wasn't it, against Crystal Palace, where off the back of that, I think they only won one of the next 6, and that was against Aston Villa's kids in the FA Cup. So hopefully it's a bit more of a turning point than that one. But yeah, there was certainly some good signs. Lots of goals is never a bad thing, but I just think, take the goals out of it, just the way that they performed, it just looked like they kind of reset and looked like a coherent unit, really, which I think probably it's fair to say in the first 3 matches of the season that probably wasn't the case.
Yeah, you mentioned that win over Palace. That was just before Fortress Anfield began to crumble, wasn't it? So let's hope that isn't kind of a prelude for what's going to happen. Jurgen Klopp's been saying through the early part of the season, actually, there'd been some decent performances. Fulham aside, he was happy with how Liverpool were playing. They just hadn't maybe got the rub of the green and got the goals that they perhaps deserved. Of course, scored the first goal in a Premier League game for the first time since time began, it almost felt like, for the Reds. But in terms of getting off the mark early and Luis Diaz getting the ball rolling, how big do you think that was? Because I even think back to the Crystal Palace game, and there was that chance very early on for James Milner that he couldn't quite take. And then it kind of felt that not the game got away from Liverpool, but of course after Palace scored, it then became a different game. Nunez got sent off, and then it was a different encounter for Liverpool. But scoring early and really putting Bournemouth straight onto the back foot really sort of seemed to be the template Liverpool have been looking to follow, albeit haven't quite been able to capitalise upon this season.
Yeah, I think it was a much faster start, certainly yesterday. It was sort of more kind of proactive and less kind of just sort of seeing what happens and going with it. And if they score, they score. It was very much a real effort, really, from Liverpool right from the start to really sort of ramp up that intensity. I think as soon as that first goal went in, you kind of knew really it was just going to be a big release, because there were, a number of questions really about that first goal. I think, we mentioned it on the podcast on Friday and kind of wondered a little bit, if it didn't come the first goal quickly, or even worse, if Bournemouth had scored the first goal, then possibly the crowd could have, changed. There would have been a few different things. But, as soon as Liverpool had scored the first goal, they'd scored the second goal. That was pretty much it. You could see that Bournemouth at that point were not going to get back into the game. Then obviously off the back of that, Liverpool go on and press home that advantage. But yeah, it was big, I think, to get that first goal. The quick start is really important. But I just think, in terms of kind of the number of goals, the way that they played, it was good signs. But, Bournemouth, we do have to caveat it. They really were poor. So the real test of whether this is, a corner turned or not is going to come on Wednesday against Newcastle. I think that'll be, well, at the very least, a considerably sterner test for Liverpool. But I think the signs were good. The fact that they've now got the kind of the talk of, 7 games in a row in the Premier League that they'd conceded the first goal. I think they had to reverse that pattern at some point. But I think for them to do it yesterday and to do it in that style, it should give confidence to the players, but also confidence probably to the crowd as well. I think, Anfield will go the fans will go to Anfield on Wednesday and expect a different Liverpool. There was, I think it's fair to say, yesterday inside the stadium a little bit of concern about the way that Liverpool had been playing. There was a bit of nervousness, but it didn't last long, did it? It was a couple of minutes in, and that question had been answered. So yeah, Liverpool have got to kick on, but I think that was important just to get that out of people's minds, really. And I think a lot of teams kind of work on the basis of confidence, and that kind of fluidity comes from that. But I think Liverpool are certainly one of those which it matters the most to, and certainly the crowd can have a big impact.
Yeah, most definitely does feel those early stages of games sometimes can be crucial, certainly at Anfield. But let's get into Roberto Firmino. 2 goals, 3 assists for him. I mean, is this the game that suits him best? Being arguably at Anfield, he's not always prolific, but up against kind of newly promoted sides or sides towards the bottom half of the table, I sort of thought back immediately to taking on Newcastle. I think it was 3 years ago in the title-winning campaign in August. He was flamboyant in the sunshine on that afternoon. A memorable, I think it was Maradona turn pass to put through Sadio Mane on that occasion. A lovely flick pass on the edge of the box, but it did seem as though this was him at his very best. Shortly after, of course, on Monday, he played more like a defensive midfielder than a striker at Old Trafford.
Yeah, it was like a completely different player almost. It was, such a relief really to see that from Roberto Firmino. Obviously, there's still another game of Darwin Núñez's suspension. I think there was maybe a little bit of a question mark around sort of what Liverpool might do. Diogo Jota is still injured. They've lost a couple of players, but it was just like watching a completely different player from Monday to Saturday. It just, in every way looked completely different. I think he set himself up much higher up the pitch. Obviously didn't have to do any defending because Bournemouth didn't really have the ball, but he was just able to kind of roam around and link play, and that's what you want from him, really. I know there were certain elements of his game that Jurgen Klopp said he was happy with it against Manchester United, and maybe that was part of the plan for him to drop deep, but against Bournemouth he just was able to kind of do what he wanted almost. And again, it was almost a confidence thing. It's been a long time since we've seen anything like this from Roberto Firmino in terms of his performance level. But I think you're right. I think this is the kind of game that you want to use him in. I think these are the kinds of games that realistically Liverpool would have looked at the start of the season. They wouldn't have expected the red card for Núñez. They probably wouldn't have expected Diogo Jota to be out for a few weeks or possibly months. It was just one of those really that I think Roberto Firmino as 5th choice to come in these matches, or possibly to come off the bench in certain other matches. I think that's kind of the role that he can be good at, and he can be a real asset for Liverpool. The problem has been that he's not been 5th choice. He's immediately come in and been 1st choice through the middle because there's no one else to play that role. So that's the thing really. I think for me is we know what he can do when he's at it. He's really at it. He hasn't been at it often enough to be the number 1 choice. But when he is sort of in that team and against those kind of players, there is still a really good player in there.
Yeah, most definitely. I don't think there's sort of much left to learn about Roberto Firmino, is there? We've seen him for so long grace Anfield and flourish for Liverpool. It was nice to see him getting his 100th goal in all competitions for the club, but equally the assisting and the work he does in and around that just highlights exactly the kind of player he is. And into the final year of his contract, you wonder off the back of a display like that if that's heading towards the conclusion of what he offers in that regard, or actually if that's just a timely reminder to say there's still plenty left to come from Roberto Firmino.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a few people kind of go, look, that's the Roberto Firmino that has to get a new contract, and that's it, it's nailed on. He's got to get the extension because look at what he can do. But I just think there's still a long way to go, really, for my mind to be changed. I think it is probably the last year of his deal. Well, it is the last year of his deal. I think it will be his last season at Liverpool in terms of what he can contribute at that level. I mean, just sort of purely on a basis of kind of averages, really. If you look at the performance he put in against Manchester United was anonymous. This one was really good, but there's not really been too much in between that, really. He's not, in the last couple of years, contributed anywhere near enough, really, for me to sort of see a new contract being put on the table for him. He's going to have a few more of these kind of games, I think, before that becomes a realistic possibility. We know he's capable of doing it, but it's more a case of, can he do it consistently? Is this, a one-off, or is this now what Roberto Firmino looks like for Liverpool? Is this the kind of the start of a comeback for him, a renaissance, or is this, just a one-off performance, and maybe Darwin Núñez will come back for the derby and he goes back to being that kind of bench role and that kind of thing. I mean, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to have him as an option. I think off the bench, certainly you've looked at Liverpool subs in the last couple of fixtures, and they have really lacked, a lot of depth and a lot of game changers from the bench. So there is, I think, a role for him to play there. But just purely on the maths of it, you look at the last 2 or 3 seasons, there's a handful of games at best where he's been at this level. This is, at the moment, a one-off, but hopefully in the next few weeks he can kind of prove me wrong and prove that this can be, a consistent performer for Liverpool again.
You also wonder if, as you mentioned there, the consistency of performance is going to be there for him to prove and demonstrate it. Obviously, he's got the Newcastle game to continue in this vein. If he puts in a similar performance again when Núñez is back, you're probably looking at going, actually, no, stick with Roberto Firmino, because he is and has deserved his place in the team equally. When Diogo Jota's fit once more, there's going to be so much competition for that central striking role that you do wonder how many opportunities are going to come his way. And when they do, he really needs to seize on every single one, because the microscope will be on him, I'm sure, in every single game. But what you mentioned there in terms of substitutes and other support players around it, first Premier League goals for the club for Harvey Elliott and for Fabio Carvalho as well, proving actually we've spoken all summer long about this midfield, and I'm sure that the speculation won't stop prior to deadline day on Thursday as to whether Liverpool can, will or should bring in another central midfield player. But in these two, maybe there's a glimmer to the future that goals are going to come from Liverpool's midfield.
Yeah, that was the first time, really. I mentioned before the kind of cohesion of this Liverpool team. This was the first time that the midfield made a little bit of sense this season as well. I think that was a big contributor, really, in terms of the defensive mistakes that Liverpool have made. They've not really had that midfield in front of them to protect them. But again, obviously comes with the big caveat of Bournemouth didn't really do much in an attacking sense in that game. But I think we saw for a half each for Elliott and Carvalho, that was kind of the first time that you'd looked at that and thought that it could really work. I think there's been a lot of question marks over whether Jordan Henderson can play on the left side of that midfield, but I thought he was brilliant against Bournemouth, really dictated the play and almost did that kind of Thiago type job on that side of the pitch, really, of keeping that ball moving, keeping the intensity and the tempo within that Liverpool team. And obviously there's bigger tests to come, but I think that for the first time looked really quite natural for him when it probably hasn't done really that much, if ever, in the past for him to play on that side. So that kind of balance, I think, looked really good. I think Fabinho looked really sharp again, which I think for a number of games, the back end of last season and the start of this, that's been a bit of a concern. And obviously the evolution in terms of that midfield, Harvey Elliott, I think, is the one at the kind of forefront of that in terms of who's going to be starting in future matches. Obviously came off at half-time with a slight sort of injury, proven to be nothing, which is good. So hopefully he can come straight back into the team on Wednesday. But I think, again, we saw a lot from him. There's been a lot of chat, really, hasn't there, about the kind of 4-2-3-1 and the Liverpool need to evolve and change formation. But I do think with Harvey Elliott in that 4-3-3, it is essentially a different formation, isn't it? It's a completely different job to what Henderson does there, or what even someone like a Naby Keita when he's fit. It's just a completely different role with one of those two players in there. And it was great to see, obviously, both of them score in the Premier League for the first time. The fact that Fabio Carvalho came in and kind of was able to slot into that role, I think is really good. And it was interesting as well that he played on the right side of that. I thought possibly he would go to the left and Henderson to the right, but they didn't do that. They kept it the same. I do think it's something we're going to see, more and more this season. But yeah, Harvey Elliott was brilliant. Again, one of those who can kind of dictate and create and move the ball from left to right, but he's obviously got that goal threat as well. And I know it's something Jurgen Klopp's spoken about for a long time, isn't it? The kind of what the Liverpool lack. Is it a goal scorer from midfield? Well, I think the answer to that was always yes, but it kind of feels like he's accepted that now as well, really, that he's obviously gone for Elliott. You'd look at Carvalho more and more over the course of this season. Even someone like Curtis Jones, I think, could be perfect for that role, whether that's off the left rather than the right. We have to wait and see. But yeah, you're starting to look at this Liverpool midfield in a slightly different way, I think. Again, got to come back to the caveat of it was Bournemouth. There'll be bigger tests. But it'd be really interesting to see if they can continue this on Wednesday night.
Last season, so much of that midfield three discussion was that it was four of Fabinho and Thiago. They were effectively nailed on, and then Henderson or Naby Keita. Do you think there's going to be an argument to say that by the end of this season, actually, Harvey Elliott's going to be very much in that conversation, maybe move ahead of Naby Keita, even perhaps by the end of the season in that right-hand sided role, move beyond Henderson and make it his role, his position, and nail down really sort of a first choice position in this 11, because we know how highly Jurgen Klopp thinks of him. He gave him so many opportunities at the start of last season before, of course, that injury at Ellen Road against Leeds United. But this season he seems to have picked up completely from that position once more, and Jurgen Klopp really full of praise for him once more.
Yeah, I think it's more than realistic that he gets himself into the kind of first choice option on that right hand side of that midfield. I think, more than anything, you'd look at him. I know he had the injury last season, but you can kind of trust him, I think, a little bit more than probably all of the other players just to stay fit purely on that basis. I mean, I'm sure at some point this season, Henderson will probably have a little knock or a little injury at some point. Obviously, Thiago and Keita definitely already have done and probably will do again. So just purely on that basis, really. I mean, he offers so much in terms of his quality, but he's also one of those that has tended not to pick up those little niggling injuries here and there. So I think that's certainly, realistic for him. I mean, the interesting thing really for Liverpool, I think, in terms of working out that pecking order is that they've got, when everyone's fit, a number of players who are kind of a similar age profile, aren't they? You look at Elliott, you'd look at Carvalho, Curtis Jones are put into the same sort of bracket. There's a lot of players who are kind of not quite first team, first 11 regulars, but pushing for that, and not all of them kind of work together. You wouldn't have, all three of those players in the same midfield, for example. It is difficult to kind of work it out, but I think at the moment there's no doubt about it. Harvey Elliott is leading the chase for that. I think it works really nicely, or certainly it did last season, where you had that kind of triangle with Salah, Trent, and him on that right hand side. I think the more we kind of see those partnerships sort of work themselves out, I think the more we'll kind of see Liverpool evolve in terms of that midfield, in terms of sort of having Elliott and having the extra threat, but also having that balance. I think that's probably what's been lacking really for so far of this season up until that Bournemouth game, was that they tried to make those changes. They tried to implement the new sort of forward line. They tried to do a couple of different things with the midfield. All of that, whilst there's been loads of injuries going on, they kind of didn't look like their usual selves in terms of fluidity, but also in terms of just keeping the ball and being able to defend by just keeping it for a few minutes. And I think Harvey Elliott can help with that, even if, initially it's maybe taking a little bit of that away. Possibly long term, that the benefit could be that Liverpool get more control and, almost go down that Manchester City path, isn't it? Of Bernardo Silva playing in there, or Phil Foden, or whoever it is. You kind of know that against most teams, they can dominate the possession. And if they're a goal up and they just need to take a breather, they can just keep the ball for 5 minutes and that's fine. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But for me, 100% Harvey Elliott has got that potential.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see if he can and maybe become Liverpool's Bernardo Silva. I actually quite like that maybe bit of a comparison there for him. Obviously, huge expectation to put on his shoulders by saying that, but he is a player who certainly looks as though he can really step up and, even despite his tender years, become a real key player for Liverpool through the course of this season. We'll have to wait and see how that does develop. Liverpool then off the mark in the Premier League with their first win of the new league season, 9-0 over Bournemouth. There'll be plenty more analysis and reaction to come across the Blood Red channel. Do join us on Monday for the Blood Red podcast. But from myself, Guy Clarke, and Matt Addison, thanks for your time and your company here on The Agenda. Until next time, it's bye for now.